Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, our in-depth look at what really mattered this week in immigration policy. I'm Jordan Lapierre.
And I'm Hunter Hallman. On the podcast this week, we're drilling down on DACA, how it got tangled up in the funding battles, what happens now, and the ideas on the table for a permanent solution.
You can subscribe to this podcast and all of BPC's podcasts on iTunes or stream on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org.
And while you're there, you can find more information about all the topics we discuss on the podcast. Just go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration.
Let's jump right into the DACA drama. I want to welcome in, as always, Theresa Cardinal-Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, Cris Ramon, Policy Analyst, and here with us this week is Michele Stockwell, Executive Director of BPCAction. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Theresa, you could say we've reached the end of Act 1 in this unfolding DACA drama. The government is back open, at least for now, and there's a promise that the Senate will take up some sort of DACA fix. How exactly did we get to this point?
So it's interesting you say Act 1. It makes me think of a movie trilogy where the middle episode is always the one where things look darkest. And maybe that's where we're at right now.
Okay, fair.
But it always gets saved by the end, and that's what I'm going to hope for. So how did we get here? Well, let's go back. President Trump, in September of last year, ended the DACA program. He was concerned that a pending litigation would render the program unconstitutional. His Justice Department said, we're not going to support this, so he ended the program. He said it was be a wind down so that after March 5th, nobody could apply for more extensions. As a matter of fact, the extension period was actually only till October. So we have people who are losing status now. More will start losing status after March 5th. And he called on Congress explicitly at that time, you have 6 months to try to get a permanent solution. So since that time, there have been various efforts on the Hill to try to get things done. What came to the head is that this was happening at the same time as Congress is trying to fund the government. Funding the government is a must-pass bill every year for Congress. That means it's an opportunity for people who are trying to get something done in a quick hurry to maybe bypass some regular order where there's widespread agreement and get it done. So that gave the Democrats, the minority, leverage to try to move DACA on this legislation. After a couple of continuing resolutions, basically the Democrats sort of said, we've run out of patience with this process. We want to insist on having it done now. That resulted in the shutdown from last week, with Democrats withheld their votes for another continuing resolution until a DACA solution be attached. And then it didn't happen. They reopened the government on Monday. It's unclear exactly why the Democrats didn't hold out any longer, but there was some sort of an agreement reached to reopen the government that included some sort of promises, we think, to move some sort of DACA legislation, but we don't know what that is. Michele, is that about right?
I think that's fair. I was actually reflecting on your guys' comments about this being Act 1. I think it's been Act 1 with many scenes in it. We've had a number of different quote-unquote deadlines on this debate, and unfortunately I think we're set up for seeing a few more before this will get resolved.
Exactly.
In a broader sense, just to take a step back, why and how is DACA so tightly wrapped up in the fight over government funding?
A lot of the big budget decisions inherently just get pushed to the end of the year. So there are a number of issues that were caught up in the whole quote-unquote end-of-year bargain, and that included things for like the Children's Health Insurance Program, community health centers, the appropriations overall funding levels, as well as the DACA debate. So this has become a big part now of the whole kind of big array of issues that still are lingering out there that still have to be resolved outside of, obviously, they deal with the Children's Health Insurance Program, but they still have to figure out where are they on the overall funding. It's also tied to the overall funding because of the president pairing this issue up with border security and the fact that they're going to have to figure out something on the appropriations process dealing with border security and tying that in with a fix on DACA.
So a lot has been made of that really remarkable bipartisan meeting at the White House a couple of weeks ago with the negotiations playing out essentially before a live TV audience.
Right.
How significant was that meeting in terms of clarifying or maybe rather muddying the scope of the debate on this issue?
So I think at the time, everyone thought it was significant that here was sort of a big bipartisan, bicameral kumbaya moment with the president. He actually looked like he was working on trying to, get agreement around the parameters of the debate. About half the meeting took place in front of the cameras and half the meeting took place behind the cameras. Coming out of that, there seemed to be a consensus among the participants, although a little wishy-washy, maybe a little soft, that at least they define the scope of what would be part of the DACA solution. And that would include a permanent solution for the Dreamers, border security, as Michele mentioned, and also these other issues the White House has brought in around family migration or chain migration and diversity visas. At least that's what everyone thought.
And those were the 4 principles that Sarah Sanders
Those were the first
about.
4 principles that Sarah Sanders talked about in the press conference after the meeting, and it seemed to be echoed on the Hill as well. So this bipartisan group of senators that Senator Durbin and Senator Graham and Gardner and Bennett and a few others had been involved in took those, went to work, and came up with something that they then thought would meet those parameters, could get bipartisan support. Apparently called the White House and said, Mr. President, we think we've got something. Can we come talk to you? This was Thursday. And that was the infamous meeting where he used the expletive about the countries. And so what started out the week on a really high positive ended the week at a really strong negative. And again, that was the deadline for the last CR. And so that was the attitude leading into the CR. I think that comment and the subsequent reaction to it galvanized a lot of Democrats to say, nope, we're done. We're not going to give this president another easy vote to fund the government when it's not clear that he's really trying to work toward a solution here.
The other thing that I think is interesting coming out of that meeting and some of the subsequent conversations, that it's very clear that I think, Trump originally sets out these kind of parameters or what he seems to be somewhat kind of his goalposts we'd like to see. And then we see time and time again now Congress coming back with something that he then rejects. And so I think there's still a sense of what is the ultimate end line for the president, which is still unclear.
Yeah, so that Durbin-Graham meeting was not the first time that it's looked like there was a deal between Congress and the White House. You can go back to the dinner with Chuck and Nancy late last year. Yeah. What was that, September or October of last year? And it looked like a deal was reached. What is the sticking point here?
That's a really good question. I think there's certainly a lot of politics at play whenever it comes to immigration. The president had made immigration a significant part of his campaign. It certainly is an issue that is of very big importance to his base. And so he believes he has some promises to keep on that end. I think, we've seen time and time again that he seems to personally have sympathy for the Dreamers, for the DACA kids. So I think he really would like to see an answer, and he's trying to reconcile those two things. And then he's got, the people around him in the White House, policy advisors, the chief of staff, who are trying to figure out how to get the most of all of that. I think that on the policies, some of the sticking points are that Republicans are going to insist on a lot of enforcement. They've been waiting for this chance to really crack down on immigration, do a lot more enforcement efforts, not just border security, but things like mandatory e-verifying, cranking down on sanctuary cities. And they see this as an opportunity to get as much of that as possible as the price for doing something on DACA and DREAM. Democrats are really opposed to an awful lot of that agenda, fundamentally. As much as they want to see a solution for the Dreamers, they're concerned about giving up too much now, and if there is more conversations to be had, what's left to do. So I think that's a lot of what's getting in the way.
It's also, we're starting to see there's differences between what is the top priority for the president and what's the top priority perhaps for some of the congressional Republicans. There seems to be a little bit of a difference. If you look at the reported last overture by Senator Schumer to the president, where essentially it seems like he apparently gave him his border wall, which now the debate seems to have shifted a little bit to where it's becoming a little bit more important to some of the folks surrounding the president, and certainly we're seeing some of the Republicans in the House expressing much more interest in legal immigration and cutting legal immigration, and certainly some of the interior enforcement issues seem to be now coming to the foreground as more important issues.
I want to go back to that brief shutdown quickly. Michele, what did Senate Democrats get out of the shutdown with respect to DACA?
It's a good question, and there's certainly differing viewpoints on that. I think that the Democratic leadership will say that what they got was the first real clear commitment from Senator McConnell to have a process to consider a deal around DACA, and that they hadn't really gotten that kind of public commitment to take up this issue in a timely fashion from Senator McConnell. There's obviously frustration among the Democratic ranks on that. Those in the base and some of the more left-leaning advocacy groups obviously are expressing frustration that Schumer didn't get enough in return for turning the government back on, whereas some of the more moderate Democrats, certainly those who are in cycling up for re-election in 2018, were clearly expressing that they were unsure about continuing a shutdown.
So how real do we think the promise is that Senate Democrats got on hearing a vote for DACA?
I think there's a real promise that to consider something in the Senate. I think the real question will be, first, can the Senate produce a package to be brought to the floor? And then the second issue is obviously all of the attention right now is on the Senate as the focal point, as the reason why the commitment to turning the government back on. But the real wild card is what happens in the House. Right now, the House really hasn't been part of the equation up till now. And then I think there's a lot of questions about what can the House take up. Speaker Ryan had said, going into this year that he was not going to take up a measure that wouldn't get the support of a majority of his majority. So we're seeing kind of now what the House considering measures like a proposal by Representative Goodlatte, just to kind of see where is the House position on this issue.
I don't want to lose sight of the fact, Cris, that we're talking about the fates of 700,000 DACA recipients and 1 million plus more who would be considered under some rubrics as dreamers. How are they reacting to the last couple of weeks of development?
I mean, I think, because without saying, a lot of them are really frustrated and really angry. It's funny that after the shutdown was announced, Theresa and I were watching Twitter and we saw the activists very much criticizing Schumer and the Democrats for selling them out. The thing is, but there are good reasons for this, and I think that if you actually look at the profile of the Dreamers and who they are, what they do, especially related to how they are as workers. The Migration Policy Institute's looking at 55% of all DACA recipients are employed. That's about 382,000 workers. So they're an important part of the communities that they live in and important to their employers. But I think it's more important to start looking at the numbers of how many will start losing their status. The Center for American Progress is saying up until March 5th, you're going to be seeing 122 people, DACA recipients, losing their status. The Cato Institute saying after March 5th, there'll be basically 1,091 individuals will be losing their status each day. The Migration Policy Institute estimates it's 915. So these are people who are losing status and then basically subject to deportation. And that not only has...
And that's happening now.
Yeah, I mean, they're losing status now, then they're definitely open to being deported. And that doesn't just simply have an impact on the communities or the families of these individuals, but also has real significant economic consequences. We at BPC estimated that if you removed 800,000 DACA recipients, that would lead to a 0.4% decline in economic growth over the next 10 years. And the Cato Institute also said repealing DACA would lead to a 60 billion decline in the federal budget over the next 10 years. And the Brookings Institution also said if you deport all these individuals, the cost of taxpayers to actually carry out these actions would be 10 billion in federal costs. So it's not just simply looking at the impact of these individuals and the impact of the families, but also the broader economic impact because they're so heavily integrated into the economy.
So just to add to that and bring it, personal, there's a lot of numbers there. I was literally just on the phone with a company that has a lot of Dreamers that's been actively involved in this debate. And what they were saying is they're trying to consider, is there any sort of option they can do when these people lose status, and they'll have some people losing status in the next couple months, to keep them in their company. It's a big multinational, so they're saying, well, maybe we could send them overseas. But then we started talking. If you were born here and you were raised here And once you lose your DACA status, you're unauthorized. If the company even were to employ them in another country, they wouldn't be able to come back. They wouldn't be able to come back for business meetings, for trainings, for team meetings, for anything. And a lot of them, most of them have their families still here. They may be married, even to American citizens, have American citizen kids. So while the company is trying to figure out what the company might do to help them out, the reality for these people is there's not another place to go. There's not another country to go to, and they could be stuck. What happens if they take a job overseas with this company and then Congress does eventually pass a DACA fix? Would they be able to come back and take advantage of that, or are they stuck? So those are the kinds of real life things that DACA recipients and their employers are dealing with right now.
So I guess that brings us to the prospects for reaching a deal. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer now says funding for a border wall is off the table. And if President Trump says if there's no wall, there's no DACA. So, Theresa, does that mean we're at an impasse?
I'd say the game of chicken is back on.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're at. I mean, I think what happened before the shutdown was that people thought we were heading toward a serious negotiation, that we'd be able to come to agreement, that there were walls and parameters. Now it really does seem like we're a little bit back to that game of chicken where, I say red, you say blue, and neither of us can agree on purple, and we'll have to figure out where we go. That having been said, as Michele said, there is a new sort of larger bipartisan centrist group that was very instrumental in negotiating the deal that got the government back up in the Senate, that is trying to see if they can come up with a package and present it to move things along. I think if there is another package presented, another deal offered, then I think both the president and Schumer and others will look at it, and maybe they'll adjust their positioning. But I think for right now, we're back in that looking at each other in a little game of chicken mode.
I think it's clear that the moderates will have to exert a more dominant voice now and really kind of push for a deal to happen. Both extremes are clearly starting to go to their political talking points where they're looking to say, where can we ultimately point blame as deportations potentially start to happen, and who's really going to own all those deportations.
So I want to go back to the 4 principles that came out of that DACA meeting of a few weeks ago at the White House. With the recent comments in mind, do we still think that those 4 principles are the frame of a final agreement? Do we think that's where this is headed?
I mean, clearly something that addresses the DACA recipients is there, as is, I think, border security. I think those are the two clearest for certain elements. The other elements, I think, are a little bit fungible, and in some ways they're being used as, I feel like, code for other issues. I think chain migration and the diversity visas really are all about dealing with legal immigration and can they cut the numbers. Mm-hmm. Something else emerged that is a little bit different than those 2 exact items. I think that's the potential is there. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's still a chance that we see something emerging on interior enforcement. Obviously, the more that gets added to this, the more this starts looking like 2013 all over
like
again.
A
comprehensive package. The harder that is to get the votes to get that done. So that's another thing to look out for, and another tipping point that could shift this into a failure.
And I think that's one of the things to watch out for in the next couple weeks is, this debate, the negotiation, if you will, the discussion among the members will probably grow and then shrink again, right? First, everything's on the table, and then they realize, okay, we can't put everything on the table. We're going to have to come back again. And we've seen that process play out several times. At the end of the day, we've said all along that we think the thing that has the best chance of getting enacted, passed by the House and Senate, signed by the president, is actually something that's pretty narrow, focused mainly on DACA recipients and border. Let's leave these other conversations to another day. That's what can most likely get done.
And then I think one last thing to consider is also exogenous shocks to the discussions. If unfortunately there's another terrorist attack, for instance, how that would be impacting the debate and the negotiations, because obviously with the 2 unfortunate attacks that we had last year, that definitely drove through the chain migration debate in Congress, especially among Republicans.
And the diversity visas.
Absolutely,
Diversity
visas
those
as
weren't
well.
part of the discussion until those attacks happened.
So, it's a great point.
Yeah.
So whether we're at an impasse or it's a chicken fight, there are several proposals on the table in both houses to provide a permanent DACA fix. Can we just run through what a few of those are?
Sure. So the main ones that had been proposed, let's start with the DREAM Act, which is the oldie but goodie, originally introduced back in the early 2000s, this year introduced by Senators Graham and Durbin. That is the broadest form of relief for the Dreamers. It would cover the most people who were brought here as children, would provide permanent status and a path to citizenship for them. The next one would probably be the RAC Act, which was introduced by Carlos Curbelo in the House, somewhat pared down version of the DREAM Act, but still just dealing with the DACA recipients. You had another bill that was introduced later by Senators Tillis and Langford in the Senate, the Succeed Act, which also provided a somewhat longer pathway to permanent residence for the Dreamers, but also contained the seeds, if you will, of some chain migration issues relating to the Dreamers, some enforcement issues relating to visa overstays. Those were the primary bills in the discussion until recently, when you saw some more stronger conservative bills. So in the Senate, there was the Secure Act, which was somewhat of a merger of the Succeed Act with some more enforcement provisions. And then most recently, the bill that Representative Goodlatte introduced with Chairman McCall of the Homeland Security Committee and several
America's Future.
Securing America's Future, which includes essentially every immigration bill that has been considered or passed by the Judiciary Committee in the last several Congresses, including things like Davis-Oliver, Cates Law, the Legal Workforce Act, which is a mandatory E-Verify Act, changes to the agricultural worker system, and significant changes to legal immigration. I also should mention that just prior to the Goodlatte bill being dropped, there was a bipartisan bill just before the shutdown introduced in the House. Will Hurd, a Republican of Texas, introduced it with Pete Aguilar, who's the deputy whip of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, a Democrat, that merged a version of the DREAM Act with a border security technology focused bill. That was an attempt at the last, I'd say the 11th hour, to try to get back to that narrow focus and see if it could gain traction. So all of those are the bills that are still out there, and my guess is that as we come back to figuring out this thing, pieces of those will crop up. Congress loves to recycle legislative language whenever they can. So if they come to consensus that this idea is a good one and it's already been introduced in one of these pieces of legislation, you'll see it brought back.
And with respect to those four principles, do each of these proposals address all of them in some way, or are we pulling bits and pieces from here and there?
No, we got bits and pieces. The only thing that had addressed totally, I think, the four pillars that the president was really dealing with was that bipartisan Gang of Six proposal, which wasn't formally introduced as a bill, that existed before the shutdown. Again, not sure if that's still back on the table, but to the extent they had drafted legislative language, just hadn't introduced it, then that may come back into play as well. But as I said, most of these other bills have pieces of it, but not the whole package.
And just to add on to Theresa's point there, I think this is really less an issue about coming up with the policies at this stage than finding the political will to just do a deal.
So is the political will there? Does this all get done by February 8th, or even if not, by the so-called March 5th DACA deadline?
I think the logistical reality at this point is we're certainly, I don't think, looking at a deal by February the 8th. I think it's probably closer to March the 5th. I think the problem with this is that once we get past February 8th, I think there's a real now situation where this is probably going to, by force, have to become decoupled from the omnibus conversations, because I think there are a number of people, particularly in the House, that went along with additional continuing resolutions because they thought another deal was going to be imminent. Those folks are going to start balking about the lack of funding increases, particularly in defense, that I think there's going to be a stronger wave of resistance on doing another CR and not dealing with the budget caps beyond February the 8th.
And I think in addition to that, one of the things that has been obscured, if you will, in this conversation by the DACA debate is the fact that they still haven't gotten agreement on the underlying budget for the federal government for the current fiscal year we are in. So
Which we're about halfway through.
We're about halfway through, and they haven't actually funded the government for this year. So I do think that, a lot of focus has been put on the DACA thing, and for better or worse, I'm not sure. There were some people who thought that if they can break the logjam and get agreement on the DACA fix, that the budget cap conversation would go easier. I'm not sure that was ever quite true, but this sort of obfuscated the fact they haven't come to agreement on these other things. And so I think if this is now no longer as close as it was, I think Michelle's right that it'll be decoupled. If it's decoupled, the chances of it getting done by March 5th, I think, go way down. In part because without this must-pass legislation, in spite of the pressure of deportations and the Dreamers themselves and their employers and the advocacy community, maybe even the White House, fundamentally there's not a must-do for Congress. It's a we really would like to do, but it's not a we're not doing our job if we don't do it, like the budget is.
And there's some people who've brought up the fact that they still have to deal with the debt ceiling, and that's up again in March.
Yeah.
That gets mentioned as another leverage point. It's true that is another must deal with item, but I have a hard time seeing the same games being played around the debt ceiling as they were being played around the shutdown.
Cris, we talked about the personal stakes a little bit for almost 2 million people involved in this debate. What happens if nothing gets done?
I think at that point, the options really are they're going to have to recede into the shadow economy, as many undocumented individuals do in this country. And like I said, that there's an economic impact for that. You can also say that you'll be losing tax revenue base. These individuals won't be able to work and report their taxes as they do under the DACA program. But I think it's also the real personal stakes is what they're going to do. They can stay here, be subject to deportation. If they decide to go back to their home countries, you have this very real problem of these individuals who've been raised in the U.S. trying to integrate into countries they don't even know. We have heard stories where individuals who from the United States who return with their parents who have been deported or they voluntarily return to their countries, that the Mexican education system actually has severe difficulties bringing these individuals because they don't speak Spanish. And they've grown up speaking largely English. So you have this whole host of issues that's not only what's going to happen to them if they lose status here and they're going to maybe go into the underground economy, or are they going to be subject to deportation? If they have to go back to their country of origin, it's also an issue for the receiving country on the end as well. So I think that there's a lot of implications for what's going to happen to them here, but also what might happen to them in the receiving communities if they have to go back to those host countries.
And I would just say that I think for the United States it's a complete waste. I mean, these are people who have been educated in our school systems, mostly in the public school systems. We've already invested taxpayer money in making them productive citizens. They are the most integrated immigrants we have in this country because they are us. They were raised here. And for us to suddenly shut them out of our country and of our economy, what have we done? We have wasted a whole lot of human capital, a whole lot of human lives. That I think is just a tragedy for the United States.
Theresa, I'll close by saying it feels like this is another moment where politics might be getting in the way of policy. How do you see us breaking past that dynamic?
I think it's the dreamers themselves. I think it's the individuals and the immigrants. Unfortunately, I'm already seeing and hearing stories reported in the press of how either party is trying to spin how this is going to affect the elections in the fall and whether or not Democrats may take back the House or the Senate, and all well and good for the political class. But the reality is these are people's lives at stake. And there's a fundamental human impact here that's lost when it becomes a game of politics that both sides are playing. And I think that we have allowed the immigration debate to devolve into a political win-lose fight between the parties oftentimes, and we're all suffering because of it. We see it in our communities. We see it in our legal immigration system, which doesn't work for people who are trying to do it the right way, for the folks who are trying to be part of our society and can't find a way to become legal, for employers, for our economy. There are just so many reasons for us to set aside all of this and try to get it fixed, that to continue to figure out who's to blame rather than figuring out how to solve the problem is the problem.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you all for being here for a difficult but detailed conversation about where we go from here. And I also want to say thanks to Gretchen Akins, who produces this podcast. That's our show for this week. You can take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter, we're at BPC_bipartisan.
And I just want to say welcome back to Jordan, my co-host. I'm glad to have you with us again.
Thank you.
And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, as well as all of BPC's podcasts on iTunes by searching Bipartisan Policy Center. Join us again next time.